I've been asked several times to comment on statin statistics when it comes to secondary prevention. So today I'm going to wade in on that. Stay tuned. I used data from 10 of the 11 studies that were used by the BMJ Open article on life extension from the use of statins, and they're summarized in this chart. I chose this because that way I wasn't making a choice and didn't have any kind of selection bias, and most of the work was done for me already. We'll take a closer look at this data as we go on. First, I want to point out this really was a hodgepodge of different studies, though most seem to be low to moderate dose therapy. The studies ranged in size from just over 4,000 to just under 20,000 participants. There were 5 that I'm using for primary prevention. There was actually a 6th one, but I'll get to that. 5 for secondary prevention. There's a mix of different statins, mix of different durations, and a mix of doses. I think I should define what I mean by primary prevention and secondary prevention. First, primary prevention is when treatment is meant to avoid a first-time event. You haven't had a heart attack, you don't have heart disease, we're trying to avoid that because some indicator, usually cholesterol, tells your doctor that there may be a problem. Secondary prevention is when the treatment is meant to avoid repeat events. Another way of looking at it is like primary is for preventing, secondary is for treatment, in the colloquial sense of the words. And in order to compare apples to apples somewhat, I use a standard formula for normalizing the risk to a standard of 10 years because these studies were all different numbers of years. As a matter of fact, the longest one was just over 6 years. I'm not going to go into the math of how this works, but just note it's not as simple as just multiplying, for example, a 5-year study by 2 to get 10-year risk values. That's just not how it works. Those of you who are familiar with probability probably recognize this formula. Where the 10-year rate by this formula, RCT rate, is the randomized control trial rate for the randomized control trial length, and you just do this manipulation and it comes out. Easy enough to do with a spreadsheet. The all-hat study I didn't include, and the reason was they weren't comparing statins to placebo, they were comparing statin use to standard care, and I couldn't find anywhere in the write-up on that study what they meant by standard care. But as it turns out, standard care actually outperforms statins for that study, but we're just going to set that aside as being kind of a different animal. The point is the resulting data here is going to be necessarily imprecise, but we're going to look at high-level trends. So I've normalized the data, like I said, and here's what we came up with. I'll just go across the columns here. The first column is the study name. N is the number of participants. About half of them were in the treated group. About half were in the control group or the placebo group or the untreated group. So there's the number of years. The percent DP is the percent of death among those who are on placebo or no treatment. The percent DT is the percent of death among people who were treated. And then the same values with the 10s means that's the value when I've normalized it to a 10-year study. And then we have the absolute risk reduction after 10 years and the relative risk reduction after 10 years. And then whether it's primary or secondary, the number of deaths projected in 10 years for those in the placebo group, the number of deaths projected for those who are in the treated group, what statin was used, and the number needed to treat. You can learn about these things by watching my video on this topic. We're most going to be concerned with the 10-year values, the percentage of deaths in 10 years among the placebo group or among the treated group, and the absolute and relative risk reductions. So here I've graphed these 10 studies where the horizontal axis is the 10-year absolute risk and the vertical axis is the absolute risk reduction that was seen. The green dots are the primary prevention studies and the red dots are the secondary prevention studies. And as you might imagine, the secondary prevention risks are much higher because these are people who have actually had cardiovascular events, which is an indicator of their ongoing risk. The purple dot there is the famous Lipitor study from this ad here where we told that there was a 36% relative risk reduction from a particular Lipitor study. The purple line here shows that 36% relative risk reduction being extrapolated across all risk levels, or at least the ones until it runs off the chart here. As you can see, none of these studies really hit that 36% relative risk reduction. It's just something I wanted to point out here. It just seems to me that this yellow line is more representative of what we are seeing for relative risk reductions, with a couple of exceptions. You'll see that there's these two red points way off the chart where the 10-year risk was greater than 50%, and they didn't get very much of a risk reduction. So this is telling us either these are anomalous, for some reason these studies were just different, or maybe it's just the case that people at that very high risk don't see the benefit from statins. Now, a couple things I want to point out. Both of these studies happen to be for rosuvastatin, which is Crestor, and we might be suspicious and just say, well, maybe Crestor just doesn't work as well. There's another Crestor study, this green one that I've just highlighted, and it kind of fell in line with everything else. It was a primary prevention study. So what we see is we have something going on here. There are these two studies that are way out of the norm. I decided then to graph it maybe a different way. Here I'm comparing the 10-year absolute risk, still along the horizontal axis, versus the relative risk reduction. And we come up with a chart like this. And if we were to put that 36% value that we derived from the Lipitor study, it would be a straight line across the top. And it seemed from the data that I saw before, excluding those two exceptional high risk points, that the relative risk reduction looks something like this. But then I looked at it more carefully and I said, well, suppose the relative risk reduction was more something like this. In other words, the more risk there is, the less of a risk reduction we get from using the statins. This curve is a much better fit and it takes in all of the values. Now you can argue, well, it seems like the dots are kind of spread around up there. This is not enough data to reach any kind of conclusion. I would like to see 100 studies graphed out like this and see if this kind of relationship holds, that the higher the risk, the lower the relative risk reduction, which brings the absolute risk reductions down a bit from what we might otherwise expect if the higher relative risk reductions were applicable across the board, which clearly they're not. So I know this was a short one. This isn't a comprehensive study. If I was suggesting this as a paper to a journal, it would be more of a proposal for a study as opposed to the study itself. It seems to me that relative risk reduction is not something we can extrapolate very far outside the data set or the characteristics of the data set from which it was derived. Yes, I suppose we could say that in a group that has a 3% risk, we might see a 36% relative risk reduction. In other words, a 1% absolute risk reduction. But once you start talking about risk values much greater than 3%, that relationship probably doesn't hold. And that intuitively makes sense to me. I wouldn't expect that if somebody had a greater than 50% risk of a heart attack over the next 10 years, that a statin would do much for them. It just seems like they're, in a sense, I hate to say this, but in a sense, they're too far gone. I'd feel this way even if I was a statin advocate, which, as you know, I'm not. This is contrary to how I've treated relative risk and absolute risk calculations in the past, where for the sake of argument, I've just allowed this 36% relative risk reduction to be applied across the board. But of course, that's probably being overly generous. Now, finally, here's a question from a commenter, and it was a good one. I'm just going to read it to us. Is there a study that compares the survival rate of people who have had a cardiac event, so we're talking about people who are into secondary prevention, then carrying on without statins versus those that do start taking statins but get other issues from statin side effects? This is really a great question because it's really getting to the heart of the matter. Are we just trading one cause of death for another by going on statins for secondary prevention? It's an important question. I don't have an answer for that yet. I'm looking for the direct answer to this question. Are there any studies? And if any of my viewers know of any of these studies, please put them in the comments because I've got to try hunting this down and seeing if I can figure this out. I suppose we could just compare the all-cause mortality rates to the cardiovascular mortality rates and see what the differences are there. I haven't thought out how that might tell us the answer to this question, but I think this is a great one and I'm really looking forward to figuring it out. So that's all I've got on this topic. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topic or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.